Welcome back to the show. It's for us. It's Zach. Upper Hand Fantasy Podcast. We are talking Week 13. Like, Week 13, man. Like, that means... So, it used to be Weeks 14, 15, and 16 were playoffs before they added the new week. Right? And, so that means that this would have been normally the last week before the playoffs start. Right? And this would have been that week. Now, it sucks that we have so many byes Week 13. We have byes Week 14. Not ideal at all for people who are trying to make it into the playoffs. Like, it sucks. But we make do with what we got. We keep fighting. And you know who's going to be fighting the most, Zach? Those teams who lost Jonathan Taylor for the next several weeks. Okay. Brutal. He's having surgery on his thumb. He'll be out for 2 to 3 weeks. Zach Moss is the guy once again. 4 top finishes in his first 5 games to start the year. He's like a high in RB2. We had a borderline RB1 play this week against Tennessee. Jonathan Taylor's 2 to 3 weeks. That's what the owner's saying. Is it possible that he gets put on IR? I think it's possible, right? Mm-hmm. When he gets taken off of IR and he's ready to go, are they going to give him 80% of the work right away? Probably not. Right. It's probably a lost season the rest of the way for Jonathan Taylor. But Zach Moss, though, you might be able to start Zach Moss even when Jonathan Taylor returns, because we kind of saw that the first time around.
Yeah. The reason this just absolutely blows even more than usual is just the timing of the injury, like you said. Like, imagine you're a team that waited until Week 7 for Jonathan Taylor to be back, 100%. He came back, I think it was Week 5, but he had those 2 weeks where he was ramping up. He didn't get the full workload. I'm sure there are plenty of teams out there that had this exact situation play out. You wait for him to come back to 100% Week 7. By the time he finally gets to 100%, you might have been 2-5, 3-4. You needed him to help you make that playoff push. He comes back. He has 3 top 10 finishes for you between Week 7 and 12. And just as you're about to make that final push, these next 2 weeks for the playoffs, he's out. You could be 6-6 right now. Or 7-5 even. You would have been thinking you're set with your RB1, RB2, wherever he was starting in your lineup. You're thinking you're set. Especially after the game this past weekend, because there wasn't any report saying that he was injured really coming out of that one. It just kind of popped up during the week. It's just terrible. So Jonathan Taylor managers, I feel you. But talk about a power shift in a lot of leagues where the person that had Jonathan Taylor that also didn't have Zach Moss as a handcuff, someone else probably has Zach Moss. And that's a huge power shift in terms of who's getting those fantasy points now of the Colts backfield. If you have Zach Moss, I'm not thinking twice about starting him. I'm not concerned about the matchups. Moss looked damn good in the games that he's played this year. 18-plus touches in each of the first 4 games this year. The Colts are perfectly content with Moss leading the backfield, I think. Obviously, as much as it sucks that Jonathan Taylor isn't going to play, I don't think that they're that worried about it with Zach Moss playing the way that he was. And, talk about an opportunity for Moss to market himself to other teams, too. He's going to be a free agent this offseason. And this is looking out in the distance. But if he can add to his already strong resume, he could end up being a factor in another backfield next season. It's really interesting to see because Zach Moss could end up being really fantasy relevant on another team or even maybe on the Colts, next season. And now, like I said, we're looking out in the distance here a little bit just based on what he's done this season. We weren't expecting him to do anything. And now suddenly he's this high-value running back.
Yeah, and, you're starting him against Tennessee. You look at the following 2 weeks, Cincinnati and Pittsburgh, good matchups too right there. You're not bad at all. So, right. Like you mentioned, the power shift, that's a great way to describe it. It is what it is. If you have Moss, you're happy. If you have JT, yeah, exactly. If you have JT, you're not so happy. Hopefully you had both. Okay. Right. Kenneth Walker, he didn't practice on Monday or Tuesday. My guess is that he'll be out this week. Another tough matchup for Zach Charbonnet. They're playing on Thursday night, by the way. That's why the practices are early in the week. But Charbonnet, he had 18 touches last week. That included 4 catches. He literally got all the work. But it was a tough matchup. I think he's still in the RB2 conversation, probably lower end RB2 this week. Tough matchup against Dallas. I just don't know if they're going to be able to move the ball, as much, right? This is not ideal for Charbonnet, right? If you have Kenneth Walker and then he's not playing this week, it's like, oh, well, I would have had a really tough decision to make, right? To play him or not this week. The last week, same thing. Now you don't have to make the decision, but now everyone who has Charbonnet has to make a tough decision here.
Yeah, and that's about where I had Charbonnet in my rankings last week. It was low-end RB2. I think it was actually like a high RB3 for me. And that was just because I figured the Seahawks wouldn't be able to keep up with the 49ers on the scoreboard. And to be honest, I think that's the same scenario we're looking at this week. In Dallas. Dallas has been walloping teams at home. I don't want to get ahead of myself here and just assume Dallas is going to win. But it sucks that Charbonnet is – we know he's absolutely talented enough to be an RB1 type handcuff to Kenneth Walker. We just might not get to see that play out this season because the 2 games Walker missed or might miss, Walker could still technically play this week, but I'm assuming he's going to be out too. Those games that he's missed have been against very good defenses. And it's going to be a game script, I think, again, where Zach Charbonnet, even if he gets a lot of work, he's not going to be doing a whole lot with it. He's worth a look as a volume-based play in my book for sure, but the upside just isn't all that great. And that's where the question comes in of, do I want to start Charbonnet or do I want to go somewhere else? Because if you have a guy like, I don't know, let's see. If you have a guy like Jerome Ford or Zach Charbonnet, who are you going to pick between those two? I know the
I'm
Browns.
picking Jerome Ford, personally.
I would go Jerome Ford there too. And I'm sure there are people out there with that decision to make. I'm pretty close to that decision. I think it's a different running back besides Charbonnet, but I have Jerome Ford. He's one of those guys you're just not sure what you're going to get. Well, you know what you're going to get. He had 11-some points these past few weeks. But the upside with Charbonnet definitely is intriguing compared to what we've seen from Jerome Ford these past few weeks. So I'm interested to see how it plays out. I just don't like the upside a whole lot. I think it's like pretty much the same matchup. And like you said, the same problem that we faced last week, this week with Charbonnet.
Let's talk about a few good matchups at quarterback. By the way, this is the quarterback and running back episode. We'll be back with another wide receiver and tight end episode this week. But let's talk about a few good matchups at quarterback. Tua this week in Washington, right? Like that one screams, crazy upside to me, right? Quarterbacks have 8 against the Commanders, right? Dak last week with 4 passing touchdowns. Tommy DeVito threw 3 touchdowns the week before. Geno Smith got in on the action with a huge game this week prior, his only huge game of the year. Tyrod Taylor had a big week against them. Desmond Ridder had a big game against them. Like, look at these names here. Like, Tua should have, a tremendous week this week.
Yeah. Like, there's no question about this one. This one's as straightforward as it gets. You don't have to think about this one at all. You're putting Tua in your lineup. He's going to be in your lineup anyway. Same with Tyreek Hill. They're about to have the games of their lives. Washington just fired Jack Del Rio. He was the defensive coordinator and the defensive backs coach. So now, not only is there no continuity on the back end, but there's also just they're getting torched every single week. So I think this is just set up for a complete massacre. I don't see a situation where Tua and Tyreek Hill aren't to a point. Even Jaylen Waddle, same type of thing. Like any of these pass catchers can get it done at the same time. Tua is set up to have probably his best day of the year because the Commanders, they're just run down right now. And the morale, it helps offenses just pummel teams even more when the morale is as low as it is right now in Washington on defense because they traded away their 2 stars, Montez Sweat and Chase Young. They have no pass rush, which is going to give Tua plenty of time. They're getting picked apart on the back, and it's just – we were talking about Dak Prescott having a perfect matchup last week. He came through. Like, this is carbon copy, just copy paste the exact same thing. And I'm expecting the exact same game script this week, as what we saw in Dallas last week with Washington. So with Miami, you have nothing to worry about. Like, you can't have a better matchup than they have this week.
I have C.J. Stroud ahead of Justin Herbert and Patrick Mahomes in my rankings this week. He's my QB 4 on the week. He has a better matchup than them, right? Justin Herbert, though, he should get it done, right? His matchup isn't as good as C.J. Stroud's going into New England. It's tough putting Stroud over him, but I think I will this week. I got a lot of shit for putting Herbert so low in my rankings last week. I had him at QB 12. He finished as the QB 13. This week he's my QB 5, okay? Because he's not going up against the Ravens. So, but Stroud, man, he's been getting it done since his bye. It's really hard to keep him out of lineups right now.
Yeah, you can't keep him out of lineups right now. And you look at the matchup, it's not like blow you away type matchup with the Broncos, but they've been allowing points to quarterbacks. I think it's the 11 most fantasy points to quarterbacks this season. And CJ Stroud's been the QB4 in fantasy points per game since returning from the bye, like you just mentioned. And it makes sense. Is it coincidence that you have him as your QB4? I don't think so. Maybe you read into that stat a little bit right there. But he could also be getting Noah Brown back this week. We're not sure, but it doesn't really matter. He could have one weapon in this offense. The way that he's playing is he's just playing out of his mind. There's nothing to really worry about here. The overall matchup right now, according to Vegas, is very high scoring potential. Both teams have implied totals of 3 or more touchdowns. It's a 47, I think, over under, which is, I think, the second highest total of the week. I might be wrong, but I know it's second or third highest. So they're expecting a lot of points in this game. The way that the Texans are built to run, it's going to be a dogfight because these are two good teams. Suddenly, like we were looking, if you look at this matchup earlier in the season, just like 4 or 5 weeks ago, like this wouldn't have a whole lot of intrigue. But the way C.J. Stroud's been playing, Denver's on a heater right now. Their defense is playing well. But I'm interested to see how they hold up against C.J. Stroud. I think C.J. Stroud can overcome this Denver Broncos defense.
Yeah, it's interesting, man. Like, and I talked about it on the show yesterday during the waiver wire show because Russell Wilson was one of my favorite quarterback pickups, right? Because he's available in a lot of leagues. Number one, number two, he has a great rest of season schedule, and it starts this week, right? So if you're hurting that quarterback, right? If you need somebody with a high floor, maybe a little bit of a ceiling moving forward, like I think Russ is your guy, right? If you're looking for somebody. And listen, man, we a lot of people have been talking about Russell Wilson, but I haven't heard much lately about Russell Wilson.
Past 5 weeks, he's playing a whole lot better. 9 total touchdowns and no interceptions over the past 5 weeks. 8 passing, 1 rushing. And did you see that pizza call that he had last week? It was like pizza, and then it was a QB read, and then he ran it like 3 times in that drive. He had the rushing touchdown. It's like, let's do more of that. That would be fantastic for fantasy football. You know what I'm saying? The other thing,
1,000%.
he's faced Kansas City and Cleveland in these past few weeks, where he's just been playing a lot better. He put up 16-plus fantasy points in both of those games. So you want to talk about a floor? Those are 2 really difficult matchups, and he came through in both of them. He's playing a lot better. I do like him the rest of the way, a lot more than I did a couple weeks ago. Like the Broncos, they've turned things around. I don't think that this is just like a fluke. I think they might finally be getting their feet underneath them there in Denver.
This isn't really Patrick Mahomes' year, is it, Zach?
No.
No. He's going up against Green Bay this week, and I was struggling, with starting him or Brock Purdy this week. Purdy's going up against Philly. They're giving up the second most fantasy points to the quarterback position. And I think I have to do it, man. Purdy's been getting it done in good matchups with a high ceiling because of all the weapons that he has. It's literally the opposite. Purdy has all the weapons in the world. Mahomes has none. So it's, none. I mean, I'm being a little bit dramatic here, but you get what I'm saying, right? So I think I'm going to do it, man. I'm going to have Purdy at 6 this week and Mahomes at 7.
Yeah. I think that I'm with you. I didn't go through my rankings yet, so it might not be like 6 to 7, but I think I would agree with you, Purdy over Mahomes this week. Just the way that they're playing, and then the matchup, too. Purdy has 7 touchdown passes over the past 3 games, and the Eagles have allowed a top 3 finish to 3 of the past 4 quarterbacks they've faced. That's Sam Howell, Dak Prescott, Josh Allen. The ceiling I don't think is astronomical with Purdy, but I think a solid 24-point outing is well within reach in this matchup. He only has to throw a few touchdowns, and the Eagles have just been letting it up on the back end. And then to talk about Patrick Mahomes, he's underperforming this season by his own standards. He's the overall QB 22 in fantasy points per game over the past 5 weeks, just 15.5 fantasy points per game. That doesn't sound like Patrick Mahomes to me, and you just said it. That's less than Matthew Stafford or Baker Mayfield in that same span. I do think he's still a QB1 in the matchup that he has against Green Bay, but I think he'll land more towards the mid to low range this week because the Packers have been relatively stiff, against quarterbacks. Not shut down, but they're only allowing the 10th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks this season.
Trevor Lawrence has had 2 straight solid fantasy performances. He gets the Bengals at home this week on Monday night. I do think this is a Travis Etienne game, and we'll get there in a little bit, but I think Lawrence is back in the top 10 for me with his last 2 performances. The fact that, he has high enough of a floor. He's had that floor all year. He just hasn't shown his ceiling, though, until these past 2 weeks. And the matchup this week, against the Bengals for quarterbacks isn't that bad at all.
Right, and it's weird because he suddenly started running the ball. He has the 3 rushing touchdowns over the past 2 weeks, which is really, doing a good thing for him. But I don't know if I want to rely on that on a weekly basis. He didn't have any rush touchdowns before these past 2 weeks on the season. So now he suddenly has these rushing touchdowns. It looks great, but I just don't think that this game is going to be that close. I think this is a situation, like you mentioned, we're going to kind of lean into that Travis Etienne conversation later on. If the Jaguars go up, you're not going to leave Trevor Lawrence in the game. Like Trevor Lawrence might throw 2 touchdowns, and if it's Travis Etienne game, he's going to have some touchdowns of his own potentially on the ground. I don't know. It might be like a self-imposed ceiling by the Jaguars offense if they go up early, because I don't really think the Bengals are going to be keeping up with anybody on the scoreboard, let alone the Jaguars. And the Jaguars pass rush has been getting it done these past few weeks too. Josh Allen, I don't know if you watched the game last week, he was all over the backfield. I just don't think Jake Browning's going to have a whole lot of success against that front. I think that this is a game where the Jaguars go up. It's going to be a positive game script, and it's going to be that Travis Etienne game. So I might not have Trevor Lawrence in my top 10. I do think he's top 15, though. So I'm tempering expectations just a little bit.
I do have a very easy request for you guys. Most of you who listen are not subscribed to the podcast. You just listen all the time, and I definitely appreciate that. But if you can take it one step forward and just take a few seconds to do that now and subscribe to the podcast, it helps us out so much. It helps keep us consistent. It helps improve the show. It helps more people find out about us, which in turn helps us improve the show. More shows can be added, more types of shows can be added. We have a lot of plans for this podcast. We have a lot of plans for this show, and it's only going to get bigger and better, but we need your help. Okay, so hitting the follow button on your podcast means a ton. Hitting subscribe on YouTube means everything as well. If you're feeling amazingly generous today, if you leave a 5-star review on your podcast app, that would mean the world too. Okay. Now, there aren't a ton of streaming options I like this week. I mentioned it on the Waiver Wire show yesterday. I like Russell Wilson this week in Houston. He's been quietly getting it done. I like Gardner Minshew in Tennessee. Derek Carr at home in a great matchup against Detroit, but he's missing a lot of his weapons, right? So I'm a little wary of putting him in my lineup if I have other options, because when I look at Jordan Love, Baker Mayfield, Matthew Stafford, Geno Smith, they all have tough matchups this week. So even without the weapons, I still might be starting Derek Carr over all those guys.
Yeah, it's just really tough. Like, I don't know if I have the stomach for Derek Carr in my lineup. That's just me. Especially with his weapons. Like, if Chris Olave is probably not going to play, he's going to be missing Rashid Shaheed. He's going to be missing. He's been missing Michael Thomas. Like, this is going to be an Alvin Kamara game, I think 100%. And maybe he can capitalize that way. But Derek Carr just historically has been the definition of mid at quarterback. Like, he's just a mid to low QB2 his whole career. That's what he's been. I don't want to say if the weapons were there, I would say, okay, maybe this is where he kind of beats back that narrative. It's a good matchup. I just feel like it's going to go to waste at this point because I don't know how much I trust A.T. Perry to be one of those guys in the receiving game that takes over. He did show a little connection with Juwan Johnson, but I don't know. This game also screams Taysom Hill to me because if they don't have anything going in the receiving game, they're just going to give it to Taysom Hill and see what he can do at this point.
It's going to be a lot of Taysom Hill, a lot of Alvin Kamara, and a lot of Juwan Johnson for the Saints this week. Hopefully Chris Olave can be back. So if Chris Olave, isn't in there, then you might want to consider guys like Jordan Love and Baker Mayfield, even in tougher matchups.
Right.
Let's move to running backs. By the way, guys, you can catch our full rankings up on upperhandfantasy.com. Those rankings will be updated throughout the week, all the way up until Sunday morning before kickoff. I think this is the bounce back week for Travis Etienne. We'll see if he's limited in practice at all this week with that chest injury he suffered during the game on Sunday, but he's at home. He had a couple of tough matchups since his bye against San Francisco, against Houston, who, by the way, they've allowed the fewest yards per carry to running backs this year. Like, a big shift there, right, in that Houston defense. But this week, he's at home against Cincinnati. The Jaguars are favored by 8.5 points, according to Fantasy Life's Game Hub. The Bengals are giving up the third most yards per carry to running backs. They've given up the 8th most rushing touchdowns per game to running backs. I wouldn't be too discouraged with his performances over the last 3 weeks. He had 26 opportunities last week. Okay, so I think this is going to be a Travis Etienne game in what should be a positive game script.
Yeah, I think that's the only way we can look at this matchup. And we just talked about it, and we just touched on how Trevor Lawrence, for me, I think takes a little bit of a hit because Travis Etienne can't have that type of success in this game. But these past few weeks, the utilization has been there. I mean, the first week coming off the bye in week 10, Travis Etienne, he only had 13 opportunities, I think it was. So that wasn't really encouraging, and he's been quiet these past few weeks compared to the heater that he was on going into the bye. He had scored a touchdown in the 4 games before the bye, each of the 4 games, 2 touchdowns in 3 of them. So you're not happy with what you've seen from Travis Etienne these past few weeks, but the game script has also not really called for him these past few games. This one is one where he can get back to that, where he's going to be the workhorse. He's going to be getting those rush attempts later into the game because I expect the Jaguars to go up. Like, do you think there's any chance the Bengals keep any type of competition in this game? Like, I don't know if I see this having any type of competitive game script here. Like, what do you think? Because I just want you to weigh in because that's how I'm looking at it.
I do not. And that's part of the reason why I do not like Joe Mixon this week. I have him ranked really low this week. Like, I don't want to play him. Okay, he's on a bad offense. He averaged 2 yards per carry last week. Jacksonville's allowing the 5th fewest yards per carry to running backs. He had one 39-yard catch that put him up to 44 yards receiving on 2 targets for the day. Unless the Bengals can move the ball through the air, which I don't think they will be able to anyway, even though this might be a decent matchup, and I think Ja'Marr Chase has a good matchup. But I just like Mixon might be able to get some work near the goal line, but like that's how I see his fantasy day, being like he would have to save his fantasy day with a touchdown. That's kind of how I feel about it, and I think the chances of that happening are pretty low anyway. So I think Mixon's going to be on my bench.
That's exactly how I was just going to say it. Like, your best case scenario is you're looking at as, okay, maybe he can save his day. Like, if you're already talking about saving the day, the game hasn't even started yet. It's like, there's no upside to be had in this matchup. It's just the way the game script's going to be. I don't think there's going to be a point where they just take the ball out of, like, Jake Browning's hands and he's like, okay, let's just give it to Joe Mixon 30 times. I don't think that's going to happen. Even if they go down, like, they're not going to just roll over and die. They're going to keep throwing the ball. I don't trust Joe Mixon in this one either. I haven't been a really big fan of him this whole season. Obviously, these past few weeks with Joe Burrow, after the bye, they were looking better. He was more consistent. But you talk about this offense. Like, you don't want to buy part of this offense really at all moving forward, especially if you can't trust Ja'Marr Chase, and I'm not, moving forward. If he doesn't have upside in this offense, how is Joe Mixon going to have upside in this offense? Because he's the least dynamic fantasy player on this offense, I think, if you ask me. And I think that you look at Joe Mixon, he is dependent on the system that he's in, the offense that he's in at this point in his career, obviously. And if the system and the offense isn't playing well, I just don't see him playing well. So I'm with you on this one. I'm going to have him ranked pretty low. I didn't see how low you have him, but he's definitely like borderline RB2 in my mind.
1,000%. And I want to hit on Alvin Kamara real quick. Like, what's the over-under on if I had to give you an over-under on 12 targets? You're taking the over or under on that one?
I understand where you're coming from with this, but I think I'd go with the under here. But I'm not ruling out. Like, I'm expecting 8-9 targets in this game with 5 or 6 catches. We just talked about how they're missing Chris Olave. They could be missing Chris Olave. We know they're missing Michael Thomas. Rashid Shaheed's going to be out. It might be all Alvin Kamara all day, for the Saints this week. It's a tough matchup against the Lions. They're allowing the fewest receptions, like you mentioned. I think I just took your notes right there. These aren't my notes; those are yours.
Okay.
But they're allowing the fewest receptions. But I think that Alvin Kamara, the way that he's been used this season, is fantastic. In terms of the receptions that he's going to be getting, I don't think that's going to be matchup dependent, especially in a matchup where he's going to be the game script, the beginning, the middle, and the end of it, with hardly any other weapons in the receiving game. So I'm definitely looking at Alvin Kamara as somebody that has a very safe floor this week. You don't have to worry about starting him. Sure, maybe the upside might not be there because they'll be able to key in on him a little bit more, but I don't think that there's any way that the Lions stop him from getting his catches in this game, and he's going to be, perfectly fine as a low RB1 or even a high RB2. I think is more comfortable for me in this week.
Yeah, I have him as a high end RB1 this week. Because of that, I just think
high end. I guess maybe with the buys,
yeah.
maybe I'm running him out a little low there. But
yeah, no, I do. I have him as a high end RB1 this week because I do think that he's going to get a ton of receptions in this game. And we've seen multiple games with him getting 10 or more receptions this year. I think I'm willing to bet that he ends up getting a pretty, some pretty good usage in this week. Rachaad White is set up nicely this week. Didn't see the targets this past week, but I'm expecting that to bounce back because he's been getting it all year long. The other thing is that he has a chance of being efficient in the run game for a second straight week, given the Panthers are bottom 5 in yards per carry given up to running backs this year. They've been good at limiting opposing running backs in the receiving game, limiting them to the second fewest yards per reception. But I think White has been good enough this year to be able to put it all together in a good matchup.
Oh, yeah, 100%. And just look at the way that he's been playing. He's been on a heater these past 5 games. He's had at least 15 PPR points in 5 of the 6 games that he's played. And in the game where he didn't, last week against the Colts, he still had over 10 points. I think it was 11. He rushed for 100 yards. That was his best game on the ground all year. So, like you just mentioned, put it together sounds like exactly what I'm expecting from him this week against the Panthers, because Tony Pollard had his get-right game against them a couple weeks ago. Derrick Henry had a get-right game. He had 2 games in a row where he wasn't playing well. He just scored 2 touchdowns. I think he could creep into the top 5 for me. He's definitely a locked and loaded RB1 play this week, just with the opportunity that he's been getting. Hopefully that the work in the receiving game bounces back. It's only a 1-game sample so far over this stretch of games where he's been playing well that we haven't seen him get that work. So if that bounce back, he's definitely going to be one of the best running backs, to start this week. The matchup is just fantastic.
You mentioned Tony Pollard. The Seahawks have given up the most fantasy points to running backs over the last 4 weeks, the fourth most over the course of the season. Pollard's been involved in the receiving game over the last 2 weeks. Also, if you look a little bit further back, 5 targets in 3 of his last 4 games. Is it going to be 3 weeks in a row for Pollard to get it done for fantasy, Zach?
Ugh, yeah, don't tempt me. Especially if you have Tony Pollard. This looks too good to be true. The matchup on paper is like, yeah, this is great. And he's finally looking like that earlier in the season, Tony Pollard. The rushing attempts haven't been there, but you mentioned the receiving work. That's been kind of, really supplementing the production that he's had. He's caught, 10 of his last 11 targets, over these past few weeks. That's definitely going to give him plenty of value in PPR leagues. He's also scored in each of the past 2 weeks, and he's got a good matchup this week. The Cowboys are at home. It's been a scoring bonanza for the Cowboys at home, every time they played this season. The only thing that concerns me is that when they do that scoring, it's Dak Prescott and the passing game that's been popping off. Dak Prescott has 3 straight home games these past 3 games with 300 passing yards and 4 passing touchdowns. Is that a streak that has to come to an end at some point? Yes. But we've seen the passing game is now the priority for the Cowboys. I don't want to rule out Tony Pollard because of that, but I do think that he's kind of still capped at that 1 touchdown a game if he's going to do it, because just the way the rest of the offense is playing. CeeDee Lamb has been quiet, even though he's found the end zone these past 2 weeks. He could have another blow-up game in this one. I think at this point, Dallas, you just have to trust the offense. I think he can have a strong performance given the way that the offense is playing right now. Everybody eats is what they were saying on Thanksgiving, and that was 100% the case. I think we could see that against Seattle. I don't think the matchup really matters in this one.
Without Jerick McKinnon in the lineup this past Sunday, Isaiah Pacheco's role increased even more than it already was at, and it was already good. But without McKinnon, Pacheco's role in the receiving game increased a ton. 68% route participation, which is something he hasn't sniffed all year, and the targets followed, right? Now he gets a solid matchup against Green Bay, right? He could put up another huge performance if McKinnon is out again or is limited. But, even if McKinnon is in, I think Pacheco is still like a high-end RB2. But if McKinnon is out, I'm moving Pacheco all the way up to a solid RB1 play this week.
Right, and that's just 100% predicated on the receiving work that he would get with Jerick McKinnon out. We saw him get that work last week. There was no competition really for him in terms of touches. He had 20 total opportunities last week, and Pacheco's perfectly fine as that early down running back. He's been getting it done this season in that role, but like you just mentioned, that receiving work put him over the top. I hope that continues. But I don't think it would happen with Jerick McKinnon playing. But like you mentioned, there's nothing to really be scared of in this matchup because he's been a consistent producer. He's been doing the same thing pretty much week in and week out. And he has upside as long as the offense continues to play well. Especially last week, they were playing really well against the Raiders. Now, it was the Raiders, and the Packers are a bit of a tougher matchup. But I think that he's going to be perfectly fine regardless. So I think this feels like we're pretty much ranking him where we've been ranking him, this whole season. It's not that much of a change. So I think you just proceed as normal at this point with, hope that maybe there is some upside for him to be an RB1. And I don't think that's like an irrational hope at this point, the way that we saw the touches shake out.
Yeah, I'm going to have Isaiah Pacheco probably as like around my RB14 or so if McKinnon plays. And if McKinnon is out, I'm probably going to have him around my RB8 or so.
That's exactly where I was going to say. Like, I know you said RB14, yeah. But RB8 was right around where I feel like it. Like, he's knocking on the door of that mid RB2 type status, but he's definitely, safely, I think, a low end RB1, the way that they've been using him.
Bijan had a great fantasy day last week. He got his touches. There were a lot of touches to go around for the Falcons running backs. Maybe we could see something similar against the Jets this week.
I think that has to be the case. And the thing for me is there were a lot of touches to go around last week in the backfield because the Falcons were up. They were just playing keep away. The Saints were chipping away with field goals the whole time. So that made it really easy for the Falcons to just run the ball. But the Jets are allowing the 7th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks this season. They've made a lot of quarterbacks look dumb. Does this smell like a Bijan Robinson game to you? Because it reeks of it to me. Just like wait till you hear about how the Jets have fared against the run this year. Arthur Smith is just salivating. Just thinking about the run-heavy game script he's about to call. Like, the Jets are allowing the 4th most fantasy points to running backs this season. That includes over the past 4 weeks as well. Jets have allowed 3 top 12 finishes at running back over the past 4 weeks. We just saw the Falcons, like you mentioned, give Bijan his work back in the receiving game from earlier this season, and that's what we kind of keyed in on earlier. I think it was earlier this week or late. Yeah, it was earlier this week in the takeaways episode. Like, we keyed in on that receiving work. If it continues, it's going to be really good for Bijan. And I could see Desmond Ridder checking it down plenty of times with the back end defense for the Jets being like the best in the league. If there was a matchup for him to turn the corner and maintain that work in, it's this one. Desmond Ridder is just going to have a hard time throwing downfield. I'm not a big fan of Drake London in this one. Not a big fan of anyone in the receiving game, passing game for Atlanta. But Bijan Robinson, I think he has a really good shot finishing very high this week, just the way that I expect the game script to be. Because I also don't think, as good as the Jets defense is, the offense isn't going to be running away from the Falcons. So it's going to keep the game competitive at the very least. And if the Falcons would go up, of course it's going to be the run game that they're going to lean on. So I think Bijan Robinson has a good chance at replicating last week's production in this one.
Yeah, I think there needs to be a big pie for Bijan to have a big slice, right? Because he's not getting the whole pie, right? So a bigger pie means a bigger slice. And the Jets are only behind the Cardinals in terms of baking the biggest pies for running backs. And they're allowing the second most running back carries per game to opposing teams. And teams are targeting their running backs at the fourth highest rate per game against the Jets. So I think this is a situation where the running backs are going to be very involved. My only concern here is that this offense can struggle against the Jets defense. Like, I can see Desmond Ridder making some massive mistakes in this game, especially even if it's limited work that he's given. But, especially with him not being at home, right? Maybe this offense just gets shut down. But I think that's overthinking it a little bit. Like, the Jets, like you mentioned, are allowing the fifth most fantasy points over the course of the season, the fourth most over the last 4 weeks. So, with all that being said, I think Bijan could have a big week this week.
Yeah, there's that. And then, like I said, so what? Even if the Jets turn him over 4 times, what are the Jets going to do on offense? Like, Breece Hall, I know they don't want him trying to get the home run ball every single time, which is just a stupid comment. I don't know if you saw that one. They're like, we don't want him going for the home run every time. Dumb comment. What did you draft Breece Hall for? It's like, makes no sense. I just don't think, even if they get all of that work, those opportunities on offense, I don't know how much they're going to capitalize. Like, I don't think there's a situation where the Jets go up by more than 10 points in this game, and that's going to keep it competitive the whole time.
1,000%. We talked about Rhamondre Stevenson as a great play moving forward. As long as the utilization he saw last week sticks, he's a high-end RB2 for me this week. Great matchup at home against the Chargers. We could see the Pats in a negative game script, and the hope is that leads to more targets for Stevenson.
Yeah. If you look up volume in the dictionary, it's Rhamondre Stevenson's name next to it. But if you look up, good offense, the Patriots are nowhere to be near, nowhere to be found. Like, you have to rely on volume here with Rhamondre Stevenson. It looked really good last week. I hope that continues. The Chargers have been pretty tough, not tough against running backs, but they've been bad against running backs. They allow a lot of points. So I'm with you on this one, Rhamondre Stevenson. It's pretty much the same spiel that we had just a couple days ago about his usage. But there's not a whole lot to be said here because the Patriots offense, quarterback situation is just horrific.
The Lions offense was completely out of sync against the Packers on Thanksgiving. They had some time to reflect on that game, and now they're up against the Saints this week. I think Gibbs is a RB1 play for me. But how should we be treating Montgomery this week?
I agree that Gibbs is an RB1 play just because we've seen the way that he's being used. We want that to happen. I think last week was just a blip on the radar. It's tough that the Lions have had 2 straight games where it looked really questionable on offense, but I think they have to turn things around at some point. The Saints are allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points to running backs this season, but that's what makes me feel like this is a Dave Montgomery game. I don't think that the Saints are going to hang around like we just talked about. Derek Carr is not going to have a whole lot of weapons. I think the Lions defense will play a lot better than they have these past 2 weeks against the Saints offense. That could lead to the Lions going up big in this one. The Lions are favored by more than a touchdown. I think that they're going to go up, and it's going to end up being a positive game script, where it's a Dave Montgomery game. The Lions go up big. They don't have to run up the mileage on Jahmyr Gibbs. Jahmyr Gibbs is great, don't get me wrong, but if you have a sports car and a dually pickup truck in the backfield, who are you going to let do the tough running for you? If you ask me, it's Dave Montgomery at this point. Jahmyr Gibbs might get the touches early on, the money touches that you want, the usage that we've seen, get some work in the receiving game. Gibbs could build up a solid fantasy point total here, but the ceiling might not be there later in the game because it might be Dave Montgomery time where he's just grinding the game out. I'm not worried about the matchup. The game script shouldn't get to a point where the running backs are nullified. Dave Montgomery, he scored a touchdown every game that he started this season besides the Buccaneers game a couple weeks ago. So I'm trusting Dave Montgomery in this one. I think that his ceiling might be a little bit higher just because of the way I'm anticipating this game to go. But like I said, Jahmyr Gibbs is that sports car, but they're not going to run the mileage up on him when they have Dave Montgomery to get those tough yards late in the game.
Yeah, I don't know that I see the Lions running away with this one, because in the games that they've really been running away with is the games at home, and they're not at home in this one, right? They're in New Orleans, they're favored by only 4 points. Vegas doesn't think that this game is going to be, like a runaway train for the Lions. With that being said, I do think David Montgomery is going to be very involved, but I think he's like kind of capped out. I don't know if he's going to get those 20 carries. I think Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be pretty involved here. So I don't know where you have Montgomery ranked. I have him down at RB 18, so I have him as a mid RB 2 this week, because at the end of the day, like, it's one of those things where early on in the year he had the upside to get you 25 carries, a couple touchdowns. Now, I think he's kind of his ceiling is like 15 to 17 carries at this point, because of the fact that Gibbs is very involved in the running game as well now. And not only that, you have a situation where, Montgomery's not involved in the receiving game like at all, like zero. So that's a little concerning too, right? So the good thing is that he scores a lot of touchdowns, and they get near the goal line a lot because this is a good offense. So I think Montgomery can definitely get it done. I mean, I don't have him that high. I have him as a mid RB2, but I do think that the Lions are going to be in this game. I mean, I'm sorry, the Saints are going to be in this game regardless. I think we might be overlooking the Saints offense a little bit here without their weapons, especially with them at home this week.
I'm comfortable overlooking the Saints offense. I'm going to die on that hill right there, and we'll see what happens next week when we see what actually happens in the game. But I'm just going to leave it. I'm going to say I don't trust the Saints offense to keep up. I think that the Lions are angry. I think they've had a couple of tough weeks. The defense hasn't played as well as we know that it can. I think that they're going to disrupt Derek Carr. Aiden Hutchinson could be playing. Like I think that this one is one where the Lions get away with it. And this is just a gut feeling with me, the way that I've seen them play. I know the Lions are a better team, and I just don't think the Saints can keep up on offense. Now, if Alvin Kamara if they actually do that, if they give Alvin Kamara his 12 targets like you just mentioned, he hits the over on that, then maybe we have a different discussion. But I don't think they're going to be able to key in on him that much, because I think the Lions are going to be able to just, prevent him from getting very far with those touches, and the downfield game isn't going to really be there for Derek Carr. We know he likes throwing the ball deep, but who's he going to be throwing to? That's my concern. Maybe if Chris Olave plays, if we find out he's playing, my tune will change. But right now I'm expecting him to just be severely undermanned.
Yeah, at this point, I think I would assume that Olave will not be in the lineup. So if you have Olave, make sure you have another option. I have Jaylen Warren as a solid RB2 this week against the Cardinals. I have Najee Harris as like a low-end RB2. I know Najee outproduced Warren last week, but I'm not sure that'll happen this week. I think if I had to bet on one guy every week, it would probably be Warren, because he's just been more efficient all year long. He's just shown more juice this year. And there's no other matchup you would rather have for your running back than Arizona. And I think both these guys can potentially get it done this week. But if you're, Warren is like kind of on that fringe all year long. Like, do I start him? Do I not? Because they have other running backs. If you're ever going to start Warren, it's this week.
Yeah. I don't think there's a question for me who I'd rather start this week. You're looking at last week. If you have tunnel vision and you look just at last week, you'd be like, oh, Najee Harris, he was the starter at the beginning of the season. He had a better game in terms of efficiency last week than Jaylen Warren. But then you look at the rest of the schedule, take off the tunnel vision glasses, and you see it's like, oh, Jaylen Warren is the most efficient running back, one of the most efficient running backs in the league right now. Najee just happened to outproduce him last week, be a little bit more efficient than him. It was outlier performances for both of them. It just switched roles. Suddenly, Najee was the efficient one last week, and Jaylen Warren was not. I think that there's much more precedent for Jaylen Warren being efficient than Najee. I think that's what it's going to come down to, because they're getting very, very similar workloads. They're obviously a big part of the offense. So I have no problem trusting either of these guys in my lineup. I think it just comes down to, if you have to make a decision between two of them, like I'm going with Warren here as well. And you mentioned that running back matchup. Just Kyron Williams exploded against him last week. That's like, it's the ideal matchup you want. I think for that reason, like, you can't go wrong with either of these guys. But Warren has the upside here. He has the upper hand when it comes to upside. But Najee Harris, still think is going to be a fine start for you. I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up with 12, 13 points anyway. If you put him in as like a flex or even an RB2, there shouldn't be any problem with that this week.
Yeah, agreed. No word on whether Devon Achane will play this week, but if he does, I still probably prefer Mostert, unless Achane gets full practices all week. And in that case, I might flip my preference because I think Achane is that explosive. But I think Mostert is the much safer play this week either way. I think both running backs can eat against Washington though if they both play. It's a great matchup. I think Mostert is like a high-end RB2 if Achane plays. But like if he isn't 100% right in terms of practice. But if Etienne is out, I think I'll move Mostert into my top 12, maybe top 10, depending on who I have to move him ahead of.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly fine. I think if Achane is out, we can definitely move Mostert in the top 12. I think he finishes in RB1 because the Commanders, they're getting torched on the back end. But Tony Pollard also had a good game last week. It just takes one touchdown for these guys to finish as RB1s against the Commanders because they're probably averaging a lot of yards per carry as well. Mostert has been efficient this year, so I'm not worried about him. But Devon Achane, like if he plays, I'm still tempering expectations. I think I agree with you here. I would still go with Mostert just because I think that this time around, could the Dolphins end up being even more cautious bringing him back at this point? Obviously he had the time off again, but they don't want to re-aggravate it again. They have the stretch run coming up. Like Devon Achane, he could be on a snap count, that kind of thing, I think, going into this one. Maybe it could be just for this game, but I think they're definitely going to walk him back a little bit easier than they were last time. Not that they threw him into the fire last time either, but we now know the nature of this injury where it could pop up again. I think Mostert is definitely going to have a handle on, the majority of the touches. And we know Devon Achane can make do with 7 or 8 touches in a game. He did that earlier this season, but at this point in his recovery, I don't know how much I trust him to make do on those touches. A couple weeks from now, it could be a completely different story. But like you mentioned, the way that this is trending, I think Raheem Mostert's the one to start. Even if Achane plays, if he has those limited practices, I don't even know. Even if he gets those full practices, I might just be like, it would be hard to bench him. But I think if I had to make a decision between two of them, I would still go with Mostert. That's just me.
It's funny because I think me too. But it's funny because I went back to watch the beginning of this game just to see like who started, who was getting more snaps to start the game. Both these guys were on the field for like 3 snaps in a row, and then Mostert was in for like the passing down, and then they were on the field again together, and then Achane got hurt. So I'm like, okay, I got 0 data there. That's great.
Was my spiel that long that you could go and dig up film? Like, did you pull up the all-time?
No, not right now.
And run through 6 or 7 plays? Or this was earlier?
This was earlier, dude. You think I did that right now while you were talking? No.
I was gonna say, like, there's no way you were able to get that in. I know I talked for a little bit, but I was like, there's no way you could pull up all 22 while I'm spieling.
No. Before this. Tough matchup for DeAndre Swift this week against San Francisco. Swift hasn't been using the receiving game as much over the last 5 weeks. Maximum 3 targets over that span. After 2 weeks of 6 targets and 10 targets, right? Like that was looking so promising, but it's been a while since that happened. But he's been efficient in the run game, But at the end of the day, he's like kind of like touchdown dependent, right? Especially in this matchup, if they don't target him a whole lot, right? So. Yeah. Not the best matchup in the world. He's my RB20 on the week, and he's that high because of the quality of offense that he's on. Normally, these running backs going up against the 49ers would be even lower. Let me ask you this. Would you rather play DeAndre Swift or Najee Harris this week?
Oh, you make me answer this question. I'm probably going to play Najee Harris just because I trust his floor more than DeAndre Swift. And with DeAndre Swift, the matchup is tough, but like you mentioned, the offense is good enough to overcome that. But then you're also contending with Jalen Hurts, who's going to be running the ball in once or twice a game. Not running the ball in, but getting pushed in. That's a discussion for another time. But the fact remains, goal line touchdowns are hard to come by for running backs in this Eagles offense. I don't trust the workload. I look at the workload that Najee Harris is getting, the matchup that he's getting. It's very similar to what DeAndre Swift is getting. And just the way that they're trending right now, the Eagles, it's a tough matchup. I think there's going to be a lot of points scored. But if you're going to attack the 49ers defense, they have a greater liability in the secondary than they do along the defensive line. They're stacked at the defensive line. They've showed that this season. They're allowing the fewest fewest fantasy points to running backs this year. So, like, it's a tough matchup for DeAndre Swift. He hasn't come through these past few weeks. I'm going to go with the momentum here. I'm just going to ride the hot hand. I think I would go with Najee Harris in this one, just because also the matchup is fantastic. And I think that he's going to have a good day regardless. It might not be a great day, but I think that Najee Harris's floor is right around DeAndre Swift's ceiling in this one, if that makes sense. So they could definitely finish close to each other, but I just trust Najee Harris more.
I hear that. Is this a week where you rather play Antonio Gibson than Brian Robinson? Because the Dolphins are favored by 9.5, according to Fantasy Life's Game Hub, and you have to think that, if Miami puts up a ton of points in this one, which we think they will, and if they do it early, which I think they will, that could mean a ton of routes for Gibson rather than a ton of rushes for Robinson.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said there, with Antonio Gibson. This is one of those weeks where you could put him in and realistically have an argument. It's like, makes sense why we should have him in our lineups. But for me, it's like I'm not that big a fan of either of them anyway. We saw it last week where neither of them got it done, even though it was a negative game script. It wasn't like Antonio Gibson just got funneled. He had these targets and they got it done. The Commanders have been pretty rough on offense, or at least they were against the Cowboys. And like I mentioned, this is like a copy-paste matchup. Maybe not as tough a defensive matchup for the Commanders to go into against Miami, but still tough anyway. I don't want to trust either of them, but if I had to pick one, I think it would probably be Antonio Gibson because I just don't see Brian Robinson. I think he's going to get his signature 8 to 11 points in this game because it's going to get out of hand pretty quickly, and I don't think they're going to be relying on him to grind out any type of yards or run the ball a whole lot in this one. You laid it out pretty nicely.
Yeah, I have Gibson as my RB25, and I have Robinson as my RB26 this week. I don't love either of them either. The Dolphins are allowing the second fewest receptions to running backs also. So
what a coincidence.
But I do lean Gibson here between the two.
Right.
Okay. I think that's going to do it for this episode, guys. We appreciate you so much. Again, our rankings are up at upperhandfantasy.com. You can go check that out there. And we'll be back. I'll be back talking about wide receivers and tight ends. I'm trying to do that tomorrow. I'm going on a little sneaky vacation at the end of this week with my entire family. Looking forward to that. So we'll be back. Hopefully you guys see me. I don't need a tan, but like when I'm back, I'll probably have one. Okay. So
sounds good.
We appreciate you guys a ton. Again, if you could subscribe to the podcast, it would mean the world to me, world to Zach, world to us, because it helps us so much. So we appreciate you guys. We'll talk to you soon. Take it easy. Later.